Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 43 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Washington Capitals, in which the Sharks have won 4-1. Sharks managing to get their revenge over a Washington team that just a couple of months ago actually shut out the San Jose Sharks, and as such, San Jose managing to split the season series against a very strong Eastern Conference opponent. And the Sharks getting the victory here tonight was very important for a multitude of reasons. One of them was that they needed a strong response after the previous game against the Lightning, which was likely their worst game of the entire season thus far, in which they just got destroyed 7-1 by the former Stanley Cup champions. And on top of that, this is also the beginning of an extremely tough road trip for the San Jose Sharks, probably their toughest road trip of the season, that sees them move through Washington, Florida, Tampa Bay, and Carolina. Funnily enough, this game here against the Washington Capitals, who are an extremely strong team, only 4 years removed from winning their own Stanley Cup, a playoff contender for sure, this game is likely to be their easiest game of this entire road trip because of just how strong their next three opponents are of Carolina, Florida, and Tampa Bay. It's kind of crazy to say when you face off against the 6th placed Eastern Conference team on a game and say that's going to be the easiest one, but when you also playing off against those three other teams, you needed to try and start things off well, and that's exactly what the Sharks did here tonight. And they had a very good start to this game as well. You could definitely point to the fact that the Sharks had multiple days off since their previous game, which was all the way back on Saturday, and so they were able to get rested and have a good start to this game, but it was still nice to see the Sharks dominated for the first 10 or so minutes of this first period, managed to get a goal to make it 1-0 San Jose. Noah Gregor got off the schneid. You didn't think he'd manage to score a goal ever again with the amount of chances he's gotten and not managed to put the puck in, but this was just a perfect setup. Hurdle with a nice pass over to Brent Burns. Burns with a very nice pass to Gregor. It was an absolute tap-in. If he had missed this empty net opportunity that he ends up scoring on, I would say send him down back to the Barracuda. Honestly, send him down to the ECHL at that point, because that is just the absolute easiest possible goal you could ever have, and Gregor manages to cash in. We'll see if that opens the dams or anything like that for him. At the halfway point, though, however, things started to go the other direction. The Capitals started getting some pretty good chances for themselves, and honestly, by the end of the first period, even though the Sharks had the 1-0 lead still, they were pretty lucky to have that, and James Reimer, who had been struggling in his previous starts, was playing exceptionally well and allowed the Sharks to keep that lead. In the second period, things kind of continued the same. The San Jose Sharks were getting some decent chances for themselves and even managed to score the one and only goal of the second period from Nick Milosh, his first career goal, but the Capitals were still putting on some very high opportunity, high danger chances on net, and James Reimer was once again coming up big, and so the Sharks held a 2-0 lead after 2 periods. It was only early in the third period where things started to get a bit dangerous for the Sharks. Just a few seconds into the third, the Capitals would cut the lead in half with a Daniel Sprong goal to make it 2-1, and for the next few minutes, the Capitals were pushing pretty heavily onto the Sharks, and Reimer had to come up with even more big saves. However, funnily enough, even though this third period was the only goal the Capitals actually managed to score in, you could also argue it was one of the Sharks' better periods of the game, if not their best period of the game, as they just heavily calmed things down. They didn't really give the Capitals a ton of great chances past the first 4 or 5 minutes of the third period, and they didn't allow the Capitals to get anything rolling at all. The Capitals even got a late period power play after the Sharks were called for a delay of game that probably should not have been called, as I think this ended up going off the stick of Brent Burns before going out of play, so it shouldn't have really been a penalty in my opinion, and yet the Capitals got the power play. They couldn't score on that. They then also pulled the goaltender. They couldn't score on that, and the Sharks would end up getting an insurance goal from Jonathan Dahlen to make it 3-1 and an empty netter from Andrew Cogliano to make it 4-1 and close out the game. On to the players to talk about. Bob Booner made the difficult decision to separate the dynamic duo of Timo Meier and Tomas Hertl for this game. The Sharks had obviously been struggling offensively, and even though that line of Meier, Hertl, and then either Barabanov and Balcers, depending on who is healthy, even though that line had been leading the way and had been lighting things up, the problem was that was the only line that was doing really anything for the San Jose Sharks. So Booner is hoping that by putting Meyer and Hertl onto two separate lines, the Sharks could at the very least have two lines going on a particular night. And well, one of them at the very least was Timo Meyer was reunited with Couture and Dahlin, two players he had been dominating on a line with earlier on this season, the early parts of this season, and that line continued to be dominant once reunited. Couture looked much better than he had in the previous games, Dahlin looked much better than he had in the previous games, and Timo Meyer just continued to look as good as he has in previous games. Not enough good things can be said about Timo Meyer's performance this season. He was racking up shot after shot, chance after chance, and he really has been the player who has just been carrying the brunt of the Sharks offense. I look at that dynamic duo of Hertl and Meyer from the previous few weeks, and I can say, Hertl played very well, but how much of that was Timo Meyer tying things together? Well, if you want to take this game as a particular judgment, you look at how well Timo Meyer did separated from Hertl and how not so great Hertl did when separated from Meyer, and maybe you have your answer there. To be fair, however, Hertl was placed with Barabanov and Gregor, so maybe not as highly talented players as Meyer was placed with, as of course you could just point to Couture as the Sharks' third best forward on the team, and Meyer gets to play with him and Hertl does not, but still, Hertl is reunited with Barabanov and Gregor, and this line has been together before. Prior to Hertl and Meyer being put on the same line, Meyer was playing a lot with Couture and Dahlin, like I've said, and Hertl was playing a lot with Barabanov and Gregor, and that line never really found any sort of chemistry together at all, and that sort of continued here tonight. While Gregor did get the goal in the first period, which was definitely nice to see, besides that, this line didn't really get much of anything going. Barabanov did very little here tonight. Hertl wasn't super apparent either, so generally the second line not so great. So it seems as though the Sharks have found themselves in a pretty similar situation where only that first line really is a heavy offensive threat. On to the third line, I've talked about how Nieto, Cogliano, and Bonino have been struggling as of late. I talked about that, if you're going to be the checking line, you can't consistently be hemmed into your own zone, and maybe they took that criticism to heart because this was actually a much improved game from these three players. They got some decent offensive shifts in the offensive zone, so things were looking pretty decent on that side of things. They obviously didn't score a goal, but actually, they were on the ice for the Milosh goal, but they themselves didn't actually score a goal. But on the bright side has to be is the fact that in the defensive zone, they were not completely abused here tonight, and that is really just the improvement that I wanted to see. Like I said in that previous review, I don't necessarily want to see this line scoring all those goals. It would be nice, but it's not what really I'm expecting. I just want them to be the solid checking line that they're supposed to be advertised as, and that began here tonight. When it comes to the fourth line, there was a substitution. Gadjevich was placed in place of Adam Raska for whatever reason. I don't know what Gadjevich has done in the games that he has played this season that makes him so deserving of immediately being injected back into the lineup. I guess since the Sharks lost 7-1, Booner is looking for something to change, but is Gadjevich over Raska really going to be the change that makes the difference? I'm not really entirely sure. Even though the Sharks did win tonight, I don't think Gadjevich played a massive role in that particular situation. Gadjevich did get into a fight here right at the end of the game with Garnet Hathaway, and it was a pretty exciting fight, I guess, but he also didn't really do anything at all when it came to actually producing on this fourth line, and the same would go with his line mates Weatherby and VL. Once again, the fourth line was not existent for the Sharks. On to the defensive side of things, and this is probably the most interesting thing to take note of because of the recent injury to Erik Carlson. He's going to be out a couple of months now, and so the Sharks really are going to be relying particularly on Brent Burns to carry the massive offensive load from the back line, from the defensive line, because when you take a look at the 5 other defensemen that the Sharks are icing in this game, none of them really scream offensive defensemen. Mario Ferraro, while he has a bit of those elements to his game, it's not really developed at all. Megna, Milosh, even though he did score a goal here tonight, Vlasic, Shemek, all these guys you think are more defensively oriented. And so Brent Burns was definitely be tasked with leading the way offensively. And this was something that he had to do, 4 or 5 years ago, let's say back in the 15-16 and 16-17 season, and he was definitely up to do it then. But now at the age of 36, is Brent Burns still going to be capable of doing that? That was really the big question coming in, but here tonight he definitely showed that at the very least he can can do it, because this was a very nice game from Brent Burns, and we needed this because the last time the Sharks dealt with some injuries on the back end, or at least some COVID protocol issues on the back end during that 6-game stretch where the Sharks basically iced an AHL squad, Brent Burns and his duo partner Mario Ferraro didn't really step up all that much. They seemed okay at times through those 6 games, but you were expecting them to be this top defensive pairing for the Sharks, and they didn't necessarily look like that during that stretch of games. So this was another opportunity, with Erik Carlson injured, with Jacob Middleton still injured, for this top pairing to step up, and that's exactly what they did. This was a very strong pairing for the Sharks. Both Ferraro and Burns looked quite good. Burns had that very nice setup on the Noah Gregor goal, and just generally looked quite solid here tonight, so that was a good thing to see. When it comes to the, I guess, second pairing, but probably third pairing of Megna and Milosh, I was quite disappointed that Ryan Merkley was actually replaced. Yes, he didn't have the best of games against the Tampa Bay Lightning, but who really did? It's kind of strange for me, in my opinion, to single out Ryan Merkley after just an absolute destruction at the hands of the Lightning 7-1. Was Merkley bad that night? Was he maybe slightly worse than other defensemen? Yes. But was he just the absolute terrible reason that the Sharks lost? No. And I don't really think that Milosh is any sort of future long-term plan for the San Jose Sharks compared to a player like Merkley is. Having said all that, I will admit that I was at the very least slightly wrong that Milosh wasn't going to be doing anything here tonight, because Milosh actually had a very good game, which was somewhat surprising, and not just because of the goal he scored, which honestly doesn't really go in most cases, if not for a Washington defenseman, Michael Kempny, running into Ilya Samsonov and essentially making it very difficult for him to make that save. But besides that, he had some nice stick work here tonight. He actually had some decent offensive zone plays, which I was very surprised to see, because that is not something I think of when I think of Nick Milosh, but it was a pretty impressive game here. So I was hoping prior to this one that Milosh would get this one game and then immediately Ryan Merkley would draw back into the lineup. But honestly, I find it going to be very difficult for Bob Booner to actually remove Milosh from the lineup after the performance he just had here tonight. So I suspect to see him once again for the next game. And then when it comes to Vlasic and Shemek, I mean, they weren't terrible. They weren't great either. They were a solid defensive pairing, I would say, which is, I guess, as much as what you can expect from these two players. When it comes to the goaltender, James Reimer, I mean, I already mentioned when going through the goals that he had been fantastic, and he was. James Reimer kept the Sharks really, I can't really say that he kept them in the game, because the Sharks were working with the lead for pretty much the entirety of this game, ever since the Noah Gregor goal decently early on in the first period. But James Reimer did a great job at protecting the lead. It was nice to see after he had struggled in his past few starts. You know, he was very much abused in that last game against the Tampa Bay Lightning. It was nowhere near his fault that the Sharks ended up losing 7-1, and yet he's the one who lets in 5 goals and has to be the one who ends up getting pulled. It's never really a good look when that does happen. And so it's nice to see that not only did the Sharks play better in front of him than they did in the previous one, but that Reimer also improved significantly from where he was in the previous one as well. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, so another decent break here between games as they will face off against the Florida Panthers, one of the best teams in the entire league, a very, very dangerous opponent, and we'll see if the Sharks can take them down. Class dismissed.